So we got one more reader here tonight, and it's a good one. It's John Shea. And he has recently had his first novel published. And I haven't read it, but it sounds really cool. It's called Cut and Run in the Bronx, a comedic police thriller. It was put out in 2012 by Seven Towers Publishers out of Dublin, Ireland. If I could do one thing in my life to put out a comedic police thriller set in the Bronx, published by an Irish publisher, I think I'd just kill myself. Not that you should, John. You should keep writing. It was received warm reviews, including this from Colin McCann, Booker Prize winner and author of Let the Great World Spin. So this is what the guy who wrote Let the Great World Spin wrote. Extremely funny, smooth, and well written, was what he said. So here we go. This is going to be John Shea. You guys should all have a feeling of excitement in your bodies right now because he's about to come read to you. John Shea, everybody.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I just want to thank Mike for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Great reading series, a great venue, and I feel honored to be up here with so many talented people. It was really a special night. So the book is a fictional account of a couple of police officers, and the story that I'm going to read is from the first chapter, and it's an older police veteran who is trying to retire and looking back on a lot of his career, and he's writing a journal. Dear Journal, I was in my late 20s when crack broke. Still a relatively young man in the larger scheme of things when long lines of dodgy wasters disappeared around corners into seemingly abandoned buildings. When there was a buzz of druggy excitement to the city, when the needle was traded in for the pipe, when overnight New York City went from dangerous place to dangerous fucking place. For the demon spawn that crack created sought it like zombies seek brains, like the very undead memorialized in B-movies seeking the living flesh, and willing to slice a stiletto blade across your cheek and make marks on your face for crack, and willing to place a loaded gun into the side of your ribs for crack, and willing to wash your windshield for crack. The squeegee industry boomed tenfold, for every crackhead had one, and if you had stock in squeegees at the time, you would have been a rich man indeed. Each crackhead seemed to have been assigned a stoplight in the city stoplight lottery, and better give them a quarter, man. Really, just roll down the window about a quarter of an inch and slide out a quarter, man. It's for the best, man, for all concerned. And at that time in the NYPD, we often had reports of babies being sold to support a habit. The Swap a Baby for Crack program was started by one enterprising entrepreneur, and like any successful business model, copied by a dozen others. I found just such a baby one time while on patrol up on the Grand Concourse, in a particularly dicey section of the South Bronx. He was left in a dumpster in the alley of an apartment complex that was pure war zone. Someone had reported that the crying from the dumpster was keeping them up all night, and so I located and then dug deep through Chinese food cartons and nasty, discarded old blood-stained clothes and tossed hefty bags to find him, and when I did, I immediately wrapped him up in warmer blankets than the one he'd been abandoned. For wasn't it mid-December, and a wee chill was blowing down the concourse as was its wont. The wind whistled and howled and shook the windows of the uniformly brown apartments lining the concourse like canyon walls, whipped around the littered wrappers of fast food burgers and the leftover hair from failed weaves like tumbleweave. The wee baby was swaddled in a shoddy blanket that would have kept warm nil in the warmth of desert summers, let alone in the cold of Bronx winters. And man, that little baby was pissed. I could not place the blame on him, really. If the booty was on the other foot, I'd be a mad wee baby as well, that's for sure. And what brought him here? Was it buyer's remorse? Did whoever purchased said baby for crack realize that there was no receipt that came along with the crying, shitting, and pissing? Did they think mistake when they realized just the amount of work that went into the care of a human being in that immature state? And did they deposit baby into the trash receptacle that he now called home? Little baby peeked blue skin cold out of the warmer blanket I had wrapped him in, and big green eyes looked up and out of and into my own, and I said to him, as I bundled him closer and sat with him there in the squad car's heat and tickled his wee little feet, "That's a fine head of hair on you, baby, and I've not seen a baby with any finer, like a pompadour, and I've not known one of your age with the like. You are the veritable Elvis of babies with that coif. And with that head of hair and that twinkle of knowledge in your eye, I can tell, baby, that you've been here before. That maybe you've walked here before and are wiser than most who call age infancy." "Wiser than most for sure, Officer Dunphy," the wee baby said, pulling a hand out from inside the blanket so that he could point accusingly. "Wiser than most indeed, because despite my age being of an unadvanced nature, my eyes are open. Wide and good. I see what there is to see now, don't I? And what the fuck? Here I am, Officer Dunphy, just popping out of the safe and warm to find the state of the world such as it is, and what the fuck?" "I have no answers for you, little baby," I said, for in truth I did not. And how do you answer such questions of valid nature? How do you give the response to validity? How do you find validation? "Well then, who does?" the wee baby continued. "Really, who does have the answers? Because I'd certainly like a word. If you can't answer my questions, Officer Dunphy, then how could I go over your head for responses? Because now really, how can this be? Is this to be expected for all who call the Bronx home? Is this the fate of all Bronx residents? The pain and sorrow, is it the sole property of Bronxites? For look at how I've begun here, Officer Dunphy, just starting my life as a Bronxonian, and I've not many defenses here against the elements and against those who would wish harm upon me, and tossed into yon dumpster there like so many year-old yams, like so much zipped-up zucchini. Can't say that and I was warned, trust you me, I was warned. I'm not coming into this completely naive, I tell you. The nature of the inhabitants of this life were described to me in detail, their faults and their foibles, their faults and their failings, warts and all. Was it in Heavy's baby-producing factory while he worked on the formation of me, sticking a finger here at the end of my hand and a nose there in the middle of my face, that God himself told me, beware, wee man, of those that would harm you down there, for it's the rough and tumble like. The very rough and tumble, the wee baby said, wiggling his wee little fingers and pointing to his wee little nose there in the middle of his face to prove a point. Yes, well, I can believe that, but really sold as a baby by my own mother nonetheless for crack. For crack, have you ever heard of such a thing in your life? And have you ever heard of such a thing in your life as the Swap a Baby for Crack program? Have you? This is a new low for all the humanity of the Bronx, is it not? And tossed in a dumpster. Come on now, tossed in a dumpster with an insufficient blanket for this cold. Where was the parental competency in all this? This course of action was nowhere in the prenatal classes. And what could I tell him? What argument could I possibly make? As Christmas carols sang on the squad car's radio of "Hark the Herald," and "Away in a Manger," and "Sleep Now, Child, for you are the love of God," and would never be sold for crack unlike other babies who are not so lucky as to be the son of the Lord. How do you respond to such substantial questions raised by a child, obviously a prodigy in the old seeing what's the fucking score category? As I looked into his eyes, still with the twinkle of God dancing despite this tepid start, I was left speechless. And my wife would have told you a rare thing indeed, for I have the tongue of iron, as she used to say, and it's the strongest muscle in my body, as she used to say, and didn't it serve us both well through the years? But speechless now, for I was beginning to wonder the fairness of it all as well. I was on the young lad's side on this one. And let me ask you this, Officer Dunphy, the baby continued, though I wished to God he would stop, for he was making me think of my own two there at home, nestled snug in their comforters, warm and toasty, weren't they? Tucked in by their mother extraordinaire and not left cold in a dumpster. The thoughts that hop into the mind of a father about what exactly you do to anyone, if anyone had tried such a thing on your own seeds, certainly popped into mine. And almost begged him to stop, but he seemed to need to get it off his wee chest. He had gone all prone-like, as if on the couch of your friendly neighborhood psychiatrist, weighing out the Jungian versus the Freudian and deciding if a cigar was just a cigar in this case. And what would old Oedipus have done if his mother had left him behind in a dumpster under an insufficiently thick blanket against the Bronx cold? Would his obsession have been the same? Would the poor bastard still have eyes in his head with which to see what there is to see of this cruel, cruel world? Let me ask you this now, Officer Dunphy, said the wee baby, continuing on regardless of my sensitivities. Where to now? What next? How will I recover from this start? Certainly a mountain to climb at this point, no? Certainly the odds stacked against. And it'd be a hell of a story if I reached any heights at all. I'll have to fight tooth and nail for survival at all now, won't I? It's always this way for the common man, now isn't it? The uphill battle for those not attached to the hotel chain or the oil magnate. It's a struggle for those who don't have favor ticked off in the status column. Common man, born from dirt, struggles to get out of the mud, no? Well, baby, this discussion has certainly taken on the socialist bent, no doubting that, with its talk of the common man and the railing against the status quo of the economic class system, and maybe some hint into land redistribution. But keep in mind, there's been others who found that by taking the bull by those that stick out of its head, that they will be able to. And where do you fit into this equation, Officer Dunphy? Let me ask you that. Where do you fit in? For you and me, no doubt, we'll meet up further down the line, what with the start I've had. And by that time, we'll be on opposite teams, won't we? We'll be fighting for separate causes soon enough, won't we? We'll be at loggerheads soon enough. And then, Officer Dunphy, it won't be the blanket of warmth you'll be wrapping around me, will it? What then will you be wrapping around me? Will it be the cuffs, the plastic ties, the false charges of a corrupt system that takes people like me with familiar starts and says, forget your start, baby, we'll be your end? Will you be whispering comforts then, Officer Dunphy? Will you bring me into this very same squad car? Will you turn on the heat graciously then and tune your squad car's radio into Christmas carols about, oh, little town of Bethlehem and the little drummer boy, and fuck you, baby, you're not the fucking Messiah now, are you? No, you won't, will you, Officer Dunphy? It was the days before the baby seat, so when it was time to leave, I held the baby in my lap with one hand, a cigarette in the other, and steering with my knees, I drove him in silence to the hospital, as again he had me nil by mouth. I stayed on there in the emergency room to make sure he was all right, for at the time my sergeant was a warm man and a caring leader, and my Uncle Dennis. And he let me take a couple of hours away from the madness. I brought him into Montefiore Hospital up on Gun Hill Road amongst the suffering of the Bronx, as we had to make our way past the shot and over the stabbed and around the raped, and wait on line right behind your man, Nate Little, who had been shot, stabbed, and then raped. The unfortunate bastard had done the treble. Our turn, and I made sure that when they checked his temperature, it was 98.6, and when they checked his blood, it was red, and when they checked his eyes, they were not crying for mommy. And I drove him from the hospital to the state and told it, be a caring state to this one here, would you please? Would you drop the monolithic, bureaucratic, faceless, heartless facade for a moment's state, and be a loving substitute to this one's parents, for his heart is gold. There at the metal-gated doors of the windowless home for the dumpster child, I said, State, we've had our falling out in the past about socialized medicine and privatization of industry and such, but this one is different. This one is special, State, so take good care. And he held my finger, good and tight, as I was letting him go, looked me dead in the eye and held tight onto my fingers they tried to pry him away. And he said no. Pulled and tugged and fought. Knew that what he was getting into was worth tugging and fighting about. Cried and moaned and wept some more until my very heart hurt. And they had his feet while he had my finger, and there's a chance he grew an inch or two in the stretching. I went home that night after my shift was finally over to babies 1 and 2 and peeked into their darkened rooms, heat on warm, blankets on snug, snoring the order of the day, sat on their bed's edge each and ran my hand through their sleeping hairs, whispered images of childhood bliss into their ears to influence their dreams, Mr. Softy shakes in Summer Park, sprinkler joy, sled run hills into pillow soft snow, pool splashes in cooling waters and sweltering heat, the capture and subsequent release of firefly twinkles and mason jar delight, and late night movies on sofa couch splendor cuddled tight. And looked at the empty space between the 2 beds and thought we could have fit one more bed. We certainly could have. One more bowl of porridge on the kitchen table wouldn't break us, not too hot and not too cold, and hand-me-downs cost nothing but the price of clothes detergent and fabric softener. So then every time since those many years ago when I am on a collar, when I take a man's hands and wrap them behind his back and lower his head into the squad car and make sure, regardless of precinct policy, that the heat is a comfortable 72 degrees, I take a moment. I take a moment there to look into that man's eyes and wonder, is that you, baby? Is that you? There's room in the bedroom yet. Thank you.